A wave the size of a house rolls under the hull, and the ship does something that looks, for a second, like it's failing. The bow drops into the trough, and the stern twists up and sideways at the same time, opposite direction. Like the whole vessel is a living thing bending at the waist. Along the sides, the planking visibly flexes in and out. Below decks, the rowing benches shift diagonally against each other, just slightly, with a groan of wood. Salt spray comes up over the rail. Ropes creak against their fittings, and every timber in the hull seems to be talking at once. If you didn't know better, you'd grab for something to brace yourself, certain the ship was about to come apart underneath you. It isn't. This is exactly what it's supposed to do. Somewhere else, on calmer water, a very different kind of ship meets a wave nowhere near as big, and it doesn't bend at all. It's not built to. Every plank is locked edge to edge into a single, rigid shell, engineered for strength through stillness, which sounds like the safer bet, right up until the sea throws something at it that rigidity can't absorb. Two completely different answers to the same problem. How do you keep a wooden hull in one piece against the open ocean, built by two of history's most capable seafaring cultures? Only one of them was designed to survive being wrong about the size of the next wave. Norse shipbuilders split oak logs with broad axes rather than sawing them, which mattered more than it sounds like it should. A shipwright would work a section of trunk with wedges and an axe, splitting it radially from the center outward into wedge-shaped boards that followed the wood's own natural lines instead of cutting across them. A sawn plank slices straight through whatever grain happens to lie in its path, leaving a weak point wherever the blade crossed a fiber. A cleft plank never does. The grain runs the entire length of the board unbroken, which is part of why a hull built this way could flex under load for years without splitting along its length. There was no drawn plan pinned to a wall. The build started with the keel, one long spine of oak laid down first, and grew outward from there almost entirely by eye, plank after plank, added in sequence. Each one measured and shaped against the curve of the one beneath it, the hull's shape emerging gradually as the shell itself took form. Only once that outer skin existed did the shipwright climb inside it and fit the ribs, which is the part that sounds backwards until you understand what the ribs are actually for. They aren't holding the hull's shape together because the hull already has its shape by the time they go in. They're there to brace it, lightly, the way a skeleton supports a body that could technically stand for a moment without one. The rivets carried the same logic all the way down to the smallest joint. Those planks were laid overlapping each other, lapped edge over edge, and at every seam, an iron nail was driven through both layers and finished on the inside with a small diamond-shaped washer called a rove. The tip hammered flat over it, close to a riveted joint in modern terms. It held the planks together firmly, but not so firmly that the joint couldn't twist a fraction of a millimeter under strain instead of splitting outright. Multiply that fractional give across a few thousand rivets running the length of a hull, and you get a structure that can absorb an enormous amount of force just by letting each joint do a small amount of moving, instead of asking 1 or 2 points to survive all of it alone. This method is called clinker construction, and even the floor timbers followed the same rule. They weren't locked rigidly to the hull itself. They attached to the keel, leaving the rest of the structure room to move independently around that central spine. That's not an accident or a shortcut. It's the entire design philosophy in one detail. Don't fight the ocean's energy. Give the hull somewhere to put it. And the method held up even as the raw material got harder to find. By the 7th century, the truly massive, arrow-straight oaks that could be split into a handful of full-length planks were already growing scarce across Scandinavia. And shipwrights adapted the same clinker technique to shorter, narrower boards without abandoning the principle underneath it. Sail south to the Mediterranean world, including the ships Rome built its navy and its trade routes on. And shipwrights were solving the exact same problem with the opposite instinct. Planks went in flush, edge to edge, no overlap, often joined with mortise-and-tenon joinery, a peg and socket system that locked each plank tight against its neighbor along the entire seam. The goal was a hull that behaved as close to one solid, continuous shell as wood could get. Maximum rigidity, minimum flex, strength through unity, rather than strength through give. In the comparatively predictable swells of the Mediterranean, that approach worked for centuries. and helped build an empire's worth of trade and naval power. But it's a design built around an assumption that the sea won't ask the hull to bend more than the joints can tolerate before something cracks. Push a rigid, flush-planked hull into open, chaotic North Atlantic water. The kind of water Norse sailors treated as a commute, and every wave that exceeds what the design expected doesn't get absorbed. It gets fought, seam by seam, joint by until something gives. For a long time this stayed, a theory read off old timbers pulled from the ground. Then, in 2007, a team at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde put it to an actual sea trial. They'd built the Sea Stallion from Glendalough, a full-scale, sailable reconstruction of Skuldelev II, the second-largest Viking longship ever recovered, originally built near Dublin around 1042 out of Irish oak. 60 rowers, a sail of roughly 112 square meters, and a genuine 44-day voyage from Roskilde to Dublin, out on the open sea rather than a test tank. The museum itself has described the build as a compromise between strength and lightness, which sounds like a marketing line until you realize it's a precise engineering description of the same instinct Norse shipwrights had already built into the original 1,000 years earlier. Don't add strength you don't need, and don't sacrifice the ability to bend for strength you only think you do. And once they hit real rough water, the crew got to witness firsthand exactly what those old written accounts of Norse ships had been describing all along. The hull moved. Not subtly, the bow and stern shifted 20 to 50 centimeters up, down, and sideways, twisting in opposite directions as each swell passed underneath. The rowing benches slid diagonally against each other. Longitudinal braces twisted at their joints. The ship's sides visibly flexed in and out with every wave. Crew members later described the feeling as closer to riding an animal than sailing a vessel. The ship seemed to breathe with each swell, instead of simply meeting it. It was enough motion that the crew's first instinct was concern. They seriously discussed reinforcing the structure, worried something fundamental had gone wrong with the build. Then they checked it against the archaeological record and the original design specifications, and found the answer had been sitting there the entire time. This was exactly how a Viking-age longship was supposed to behave in a real sea. The flexing wasn't damage in progress. It was the entire hull working as one coordinated system, spreading the ocean's force across dozens of moving joints instead of concentrating it on a handful of rigid ones. Which is precisely why, centuries earlier, ships built this way could survive North Atlantic crossings that a stiffer Mediterranean hull was never designed to take on. It's the same flex, not incidentally, that let ships built on this principle make the crossings that put the word Viking into the history books in the first place, to Iceland, to Greenland, and eventually to a landfall in North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. Voyage as a rigid hull was never built to survive. This wasn't a single clever prototype. It was a design language, repeated across the archaeological record for centuries. The Oseberg ship, pulled from Norwegian soil in 1906, remains the best-preserved Viking vessel ever found. The Gokstad ship, recovered in 1880 and built around 890 AD, shows a visibly more developed mass support system than its predecessors. Evidence of a tradition actively refining itself over generations, not repeating one lucky design by accident. Both of them, tellingly, were pulled out of the ground not as shipwrecks but as burial mounds. The Oseberg ship built to carry 2 Norse women into the next world. The Gokstad ship built for a chieftain, packed with grave goods, from carved sledges to a ceremonial cart, precisely because a hull this well-engineered was treated as a treasure worth burying alongside its owner, not just a tool worth wearing out and discarding. And between 1957 and 1996, excavations at Roskilde recovered 9 separate medieval vessels deliberately sunk as a defensive blockade, including one longship roughly 36 meters long, built to carry 72 oars and up to 100 people. Modern replicas built to these same specifications have logged speeds up to 14 knots under sail, and the deliberate absence of a deep, rigid keel gave these hulls something else the Mediterranean design didn't prioritize: the ability to slip into shallow river mouths and estuaries most other ships of the era couldn't touch at all. That single feature is a large part of why Norse raiding and trading parties could show up somewhere no one expected a sea-going vessel to reach, sailing straight up a river mouth that a Mediterranean-style hull would have run aground in. deep enough inland to threaten a settlement that had assumed the sea itself was its outer wall of defense. The same hull that flexed through an Atlantic gale could turn around and glide through a couple of meters of river water without ever needing a harbor built to receive it. Generation after generation, across multiple named ships, the same principle kept getting rebuilt. Let the hull move, and it will carry you places a stiffer-looking ship simply can't survive reaching. So why did Roman ships keep sinking in conditions Viking ships sailed straight through? Not because Roman shipwrights were worse at their craft. Mediterranean flush-planked, mortise-and-tenon construction was a genuinely sophisticated answer to the sea most of those ships actually had to cross. It just answered a different question. It was built for strength through rigidity, in water that mostly rewarded rigidity. Norse shipbuilders, working the open North Atlantic, arrived at something that looked, on first glance, less impressive. Overlapping planks, a shell built before the frame, joints deliberately left loose enough to move. It wasn't less impressive. It was built around a different, harder truth, that no wooden hull can outmuscle the ocean directly. So the only real move is to let the ship absorb the fight instead of standing rigidly against it. A crew testing that same design nearly 1,000 years later got frightened by how much their reconstruction moved under them. Right before discovering that the fear itself was proof the old design was still working exactly as intended. Two civilizations, two answers to the same wave. Only one of them was built assuming from the very first plank that it might be wrong about how big that wave could get, and building in room to bend instead of break.